The first stone was the size of a winter squash and weighed nearly as much as she did. Ilara found it half buried in the creek bed, its surface worn smooth by 1,000 years of rushing water. She wrapped her arms around it, dug her fingers into the damp soil beneath, and heaved. The stone did not move. Her dog, a rangy brown mutt named Boro, with eyes the color of old amber, watched from the bank, his head cocked. He gave a low whine, a question she could not answer. She took a breath, the cold autumn air stinging her lungs, and tried again. This time, she used her legs, squatting low and pushing upward. The stone shifted, a grudging groan of rock against earth, and rolled free. It took her the better part of an hour to wrestle it up the muddy bank, and another 2 to roll it, end over end, the quarter-mile back to the cabin. When she finally nudged it into place against the cabin's bare interior wall, her hands were raw, and her back was a single throbbing ache. Boro nudged his wet nose into her palm, a silent offering of support. It was the first of 200. The cabin itself was a puzzle. Liam, her husband of 3 short years, had built it with his own hands, but he had died before he could finish it. He had left her this sturdy, empty box of pine and oak on a forgotten patch of land, and a set of journals filled with his strange, meticulous drawings. The most glaring omission, the one every person in the nearby town of Hemlock's Ford mentioned, was the fireplace. Or rather, the lack of one. There was no hearth, no chimney, no break in the roof for a stovepipe. It was a wooden tomb waiting for winter. Silas Blackwood was the first to say it outright. He was a man whose face was a road map of 70 hard winters. And he stopped his wagon on the dirt track above her property, watching her haul a sled laden with buckets of gray clay from the river flats. "What in God's name are you doing, girl?" he called down, his voice raspy as a dry corn husk. Ilara shielded her eyes against the low sun. "I have a plan." "A plan?" He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "I see a plan for freezing to death. That cabin's got no heart, no fireplace. Are you planning to burn goodwill to stay warm?" "This is for the heart," she said, nodding to the clay. Her voice was quiet, easily swallowed by the breeze. Silas squinted, his gaze drifting to the growing pile of river stones near her door. He saw the first one, the big one, already set inside. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. You can't build a hearth out of river stone and mud, Ilara. They'll crack. They'll explode. You'll burn the whole place down around your ears." "It'll work," she said. It was the same thing she had said to herself 100 times, tracing the complex diagrams in Liam's journal. Silas just shook his head, a gesture of pity. "You wait until the first real snow. You wait until the north wind comes howling down that valley. You'll be begging for a spot by a real fire in town. Mark my words." He flicked the reins, and his wagon creaked away, leaving her in a cloud of dust and doubt. Boro growled low in his chest, not at Silas, but at the truth in his warning. Winter was coming. The journal was her scripture. Liam's handwriting was a precise, angular script, and the drawings were rendered with an engineer's clarity. He hadn't been an engineer, just a man who read forgotten books and believed the old ways were sometimes smarter. The chapter she had dog-eared was titled The Thermal Core. It was not a fireplace. A fireplace, he'd written, sends 80% of its heat straight up the chimney. A foolish waste. A fire is a brief, violent event. The goal is not to sustain the fire, but to capture its soul. The diagrams showed a labyrinthine series of channels and baffles, a maze for smoke and heat, all encased in a massive shell of stone and earth. A single hot fire for 2 hours, the journal promised, would heat the core's mass, which would then radiate a gentle, steady warmth for the next 24. It was an old idea from a colder country, a country that understood patience. Her days fell into a rhythm of brutal, repetitive labor. Mornings were for the clay. She'd take her sled and shovel down to the river, dig the heavy plastic earth, and haul it back. The weight of it strained her shoulders, and the cold water numbed her fingers to the bone. Afternoons were for the stones. She learned to read the landscape, to spot the telltale hump of a suitable stone hiding under a blanket of pine needles. She learned to use a lever, a sturdy oak branch, to pry the stubborn ones from the earth's grip. Burro was her constant shadow, sometimes digging alongside her with frantic paws, other times sitting patient and still, a silent, furry foreman. Mrs. Gable, who ran the town's small mercantile, brought her a basket one afternoon. It was filled with bread, a jar of apple butter, and a thick wool blanket. "Dear," she said, her kind face etched with worry, "Silas tells me you're building something. He's worried. We're all worried." "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable. Thank you for the food. But what will you do when the snows come? You can't live in there. It isn't safe. My sister has a spare room. You could stay the winter there. Liam would have wanted you to be safe." Elara looked from the woman's earnest face to the half-finished structure inside her cabin. It was now 3 feet high, a rough, circular wall of gray stone and dark mortar. It looked primal, like some ancient altar. "This is my home," she said, her voice soft but immovable. Mrs. Gable sighed, patting Elara's arm. Her touch was meant to be comforting, but it felt like a plea. "Stubborn as your husband, bless his heart. Well, don't be too proud to ask for help when you need it." Elara just nodded. She knew they meant well. They saw a grieving widow, young and alone, making a foolish mistake. They saw a tragedy in the making. They did not see the diagrams in the journal. They did not feel the conviction that settled in her bones, a conviction that was part Liam's legacy and part her own quiet defiance. The work was a meditation. As she mixed the mortar, 3 parts sand, 1 part clay, a handful of chopped straw, her mind emptied. She wasn't thinking of her loss, or the coming cold, or the pitying looks from the town. She was thinking only of the consistency of the mud, the fit of one stone against another, the slight, satisfying scrape as it settled into place. Her hands, once soft, became a cartographer's map of her labor. They were calloused, scraped, and stained with clay, the fingernails permanently rimmed with dirt. One evening, a stone slipped, catching the back of her left hand and tearing a long, shallow gash. She hissed in pain, and Burro was there instantly, licking the wound with a gentle tongue. She went inside, washed it with cold water, and wrapped it tightly with a strip of clean linen. The next morning, the hand throbbed with every stone she lifted, a constant reminder of the cost of her task. Inside the outer stone shell, she began the core's true secret: the firebox and the flue channels. For this, she needed firebrick, a material she could not dig from the earth. She took the small pouch of money Liam had left her, counted out $17, and hitched a ride with the mail carrier to the next county, where a small brickworks still operated. The owner, a man with soot in the lines of his face, looked at her order for 200 high-temperature fire bricks with suspicion. "Building a forge?" he asked. "A heater," she replied. "A heater needs a chimney." "It has one. Inside." He shook his head, another man convinced of her folly, but he took her money. Getting the bricks back was an ordeal. She had to pay a farmer with a sturdy wagon $5, nearly a quarter of her remaining funds, to haul them to the edge of her property. From there, she carried them herself, 10 bricks at a time, stacked in a canvas sling that bit into her shoulders. Each brick was a promise. Each one was a piece of the defiant warmth she was building against the world's cold. She laid the fire bricks according to Liam's precise drawing, creating a J-shaped channel for the fire, then a complex series of switchbacks for the exhaust gases. The smoke would be forced to travel up, then down, then up again, shedding its heat into the surrounding mass of brick and clay before finally exiting through a small pipe near the floor that would vent out the back wall. It was counterintuitive. Heat rises, everyone knew that. But Liam's journal insisted, force the heat to surrender its energy before you let it escape. As she worked, she could almost feel his presence, a quiet approval in the stillness of the cabin. She spoke to him, and to Boro. "This one goes here, you see? So the smoke has to turn. It gets angry, but it gets tired. It gives up its warmth right here." Boro would thump his tail against the floorboards, her only parishioner. Autumn bled into the gray stillness of late November. The first frosts left a silver sheen on the fallen leaves. The air grew teeth. Thomas Blackwood, Silas's son, began to appear. He was a quiet young man with his father's solid build, but none of his cynical certainty. He didn't offer advice or warnings. He just watched. The first time, he stood at the tree line for 10 minutes before approaching. "My father said you were building something," he said, his eyes on the structure that now dominated the single room of the cabin. It was nearly 5 feet tall and 6 feet around, a hulking cylinder of stone. "I am," Ilara said, not stopping her work of plastering the exterior with a final, smooth layer of clay. "He doesn't think it will work." "I know." Thomas stayed for another minute, then left. He came back 2 days later. Ilara was on a small stool, reaching to smooth the top of the core. He didn't say anything, just handed her a tin cup of hot coffee. She took it, the warmth a shock to her cold hands. She drank it, handed it back, and murmured her thanks. He just nodded and left. His visits became a quiet ritual. He would appear, sometimes with coffee, once with a freshly baked loaf of bread from his mother, and simply watch her work. He saw the logic in her movements, the purpose in her endless toil. He was the first person who looked at her not with pity, but with a dawning curiosity. The day she finished, the sky was the color of lead. A few lazy snowflakes drifted down, melting on the damp earth. The core stood in the center of her cabin like a dormant beast. It was massive, solid, its surface a smooth, pale gray. It had taken her 3 months, 200 river stones, countless buckets of clay, 200 fire bricks, and every ounce of strength she possessed. She ran her hands over its cool, curved surface. It felt like a monument to a faith only she and a dead man shared. "Well," she said to Boro, who sat at her feet, his tail a slow metronome against the floor. "Now we see." That evening, as the wind began to moan around the corners of the cabin, she laid the first fire. She followed Liam's instructions to the letter. A small armful of dry, split kindling and 3 logs of seasoned oak, no more. She lit it. The fire caught quickly in the enclosed firebox, roaring to life with a ferocity that was almost frightening. It was not the gentle, flickering fire of a hearth, it was a contained inferno. The draft pulled with a low, powerful hum. She sat on the floor, watching the orange light flicker through the small cast-iron door, feeling the intense heat on her face. Boro lay with his head on his paws, watching not the fire, but her. After exactly 90 minutes, when the wood had burned down to a deep bed of glowing coals, she followed the final, crucial instruction. She closed the draft and sealed the firebox door, plunging the room into near darkness. And then there was only silence. The humming stopped. The light was gone. For a moment, a terrible, cold doubt washed over her. Silas's words echoed in her mind. "The craziest thing I've ever seen." She had encased a fire in a tomb of mud and stone. She placed her hand on the core's surface. It was still cool. An hour passed. The wind rose outside, shrieking like a predator. The temperature in the cabin began to drop. Boro shivered and pressed closer to her. Ilara pulled a blanket around them both, her heart a cold knot in her chest. She had failed. She had spent a season of back-breaking labor to build a beautiful, useless sculpture. Then she felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth under her palm. She pressed her whole hand against the stone. It was there. A slow, deep heat blooming from within. Over the next hour, the entire surface of the massive core warmed, not to a dangerous burning heat, but to the pleasant, penetrating warmth of a sun-baked stone on a summer afternoon. The chill in the room did not vanish. It was pushed back. The air became soft, gentle. The warmth radiated outward, filling the small cabin, a silent, powerful presence. It was a warmth that felt ancient and alive. Ilara leaned against it, pressing her cheek to the stone, and closed her eyes. Tears she didn't know she was holding slid down her face. "It works, Liam," she whispered into the quiet, warm room. "It works." Boro sighed, a deep, contented sound, and fell asleep. The snow began that night. It started as a flurry, then thickened into a blinding curtain of white. By morning, it was a foot deep and showed no signs of stopping. The wind howled, a constant physical pressure against the cabin walls. In town, chimneys struggled. The wind drove smoke back down, filling houses with acrid fumes. Fires had to be kept dangerously high just to combat the drafts that snaked through every crack and crevice. Ilara's cabin was an island of calm. The thermal core radiated its steady, silent heat. There was no draft, no smoke, no roaring fire to tend. Every 12 hours, she would open the firebox, scoop out the fine ash, and burn another small, fast fire. The rest of the time, there was only the profound, comforting warmth of the stone. For 3 days, the world disappeared into a maelstrom of white. She and Boro were entirely alone, cocooned in the warmth she had built with her own hands. She had food, water from melted snow, and the quiet satisfaction of her victory. On the 4th day, there was a frantic pounding at the door. It was so muffled by the snow and wind that at first she thought she'd imagined it. Boro scrambled to his feet, barking. Ilara unbarred the door. A figure, completely covered in snow, stumbled inside, followed by a blast of Arctic air. It was Mrs. Gable, her face pale and her lips blue. "Ilara," she gasped, shivering violently. "Our fire, the chimney's blocked with snow. It's so cold. We can't get it to draw." Her eyes, wide with panic, suddenly registered the air in the cabin. She stopped, looking around in confusion. "But it's warm in here. How is it warm?" Her gaze fell upon the massive stone cylinder in the center of the room. She reached out a trembling hand and touched its surface. A look of pure astonishment spread across her face. "What is this?" "It's the heart," Ilara said simply. She helped the older woman out of her frozen coat and sat her down on a stool, pushing it close to the core. Mrs. Gable leaned against it, soaking in the gentle heat, her shivering slowly subsiding. An hour later, more figures arrived. It was Silas Blackwood and his son, Thomas. Silas looked haggard, his usual cynicism stripped away by the raw bite of the cold. His house, one of the oldest and proudest in the valley, was now a death trap of frigid air and choking smoke. He had come to fetch Mrs. Gable, to take her to the town hall where others were gathering. He stopped dead just inside the door, his reaction a mirror of Mrs. Gable's. He stared at the core, at the placid, warm air, at the absence of a roaring fire. He looked at Ilara, who was quietly making broth on a small cooktop set on the core's surface. He walked over to the stone, the snow melting from his boots and hissing on the floor. He laid a calloused, trembling hand on its surface. He felt the deep, radiant heat. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, searching for the trick, the hidden stove, the source of the impossible warmth. He found nothing. "I don't understand," he said, his voice raspy with more than just the cold. He looked at Ilara, his eyes stripped of all their previous mockery. There was only a raw, desperate confusion. The wind. It should be tearing the heat right out of this place. "The heat is in the stone," Ilara said. "The wind can't touch it." That night, 7 people slept on the floor of Ilara's cabin. By the next day, it was 15. The great blizzard, the one they would later call the White Hurricane, had broken the town. It had defeated their conventional wisdom, their iron stoves and their brick chimneys. They came to the one place that should have been the coldest, the cabin with no fireplace, and found the only reliable warmth in the valley. They huddled together in the small space, a strange congregation of former skeptics, drawn to the impossible altar a lone woman had built. They watched in awe as she performed the ritual. The quick, violent fire, the sealing of the door, and the long, patient miracle of the radiating stone. No one spoke of her foolishness now. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones, as if witnessing something sacred. Mr. Abernathy, the town's portly and important mayor, was one of the last to seek shelter. He arrived, blustering about the town hall's failing generator, and fell silent the moment he stepped inside. He, a man who had publicly called Ilara's project a monument to grief-stricken folly, now sat on her floor, gratefully accepting a cup of her hot broth, his back pressed against the warm stone. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the steady, life-giving heat, the town's rigid hierarchy dissolved. They were just people, cold and afraid, saved by the one person they had all pitied. Ilara moved among them, a quiet, unassuming host. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. The warmth was her vindication. When the storm finally broke after 6 days, the world was transformed. The valley was buried under 7 feet of snow, a landscape of sweeping, silent white. As the townspeople dug themselves out, something else had changed. The way they looked at Ilara was different. The pity was gone, replaced by a deep and humbling respect. Silas Blackwood came to her cabin a week later. The sun was brilliant on the snow, and the air was still and cold. He didn't knock. He just stood at the door until she saw him. He held his hat in his hands. "I came to say I was wrong," he said, his voice low. He wouldn't meet her eyes, instead staring at the core, which was radiating a soft warmth into the bright afternoon. "What you built here, it saved us. My wife, my grandchildren, they were in your cabin that night." He finally looked at her. "I've lived in this valley my whole life. I thought I knew everything there was to know about winter. I knew nothing." He paused, then gave a small, wry smile. "That thing? It'll work." It was a perfect echo of her own words, offered back to her now not as a challenge, but as a concession. It was the most profound apology he could offer. That spring, a change began. It started with Silas. He asked Ilara if she would look at his hearth. He wanted to build a core inside his own home. Thomas, who had been her silent supporter, became her first true apprentice. Together they went to Silas's house, and Ilara, with Liam's journal open on the table, began to teach them. She showed them how to mix the clay, how to lay the fire brick, how to create the labyrinth for the heat. Other families came to watch, then to ask for help. What she had built was not just a heater, it was a new idea. It spread through Hemlock's Ford not like a fire, but like a slow, rising warmth. The following summer, the valley was filled with the sounds of people hauling stone and mixing mud. Ilara, once the town eccentric, was now its most respected mind. She and Thomas led the work, moving from house to house. They built a large core in the town hall, another in the schoolhouse. They taught fathers and sons the patient art of capturing the fire's soul. The town, once a collection of self-reliant and skeptical families, became a community, bound by shared labor and the common goal of a warmer, safer winter. They were no longer preparing to fight the cold. They were preparing to welcome it. 5 winters passed, each one easier than the last. The thermal cores, now present in nearly every home, transformed the rhythm of life. The frantic, constant work of feeding a fire was replaced by a calm, twice-daily ritual. The air in the houses was cleaner, the warmth more profound. The White Hurricane became a landmark in the town's history, the great trial that had forced them to change. And at the center of that story was always Ilara. 10 years on, the valley was thriving. The knowledge of the cores had spread to neighboring counties, carried by Thomas, who was now a master builder in his own right. He had married a girl from town, and their first child was born in a house kept warm by a stone heart he and Ilara had built together. Ilara never remarried. Her life was the cabin, the quiet woods, and the enduring warmth of the first core. She was no longer young, her hair showing streaks of gray, but her eyes held a deep, peaceful clarity. Boro grew old. His amber eyes clouded over, and his sturdy legs grew stiff. He spent most of his days sleeping in his favorite spot, his side pressed against the gentle heat of the core he had watched her build. He had been her first believer, her only witness during the long months of labor and doubt. One cold winter morning, Ilara woke to find he had passed peacefully in his sleep. His body was still warm from the stone. She carried him outside and buried him on the small hill overlooking the cabin, beneath a tall pine tree. She wept, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with the quiet sorrow of a long and loving farewell. She placed a single, smooth river stone on the small mound of earth. There was no one to see, no one to offer comfort, but she was not alone. The cabin was warm. The children who had huddled on her floor during the great storm now had children of their own. They grew up with the story of the woman who built a heart of stone. To them, she was a legend, a figure from a folk tale. They would visit her sometimes, bringing her gifts of firewood or fresh bread, and listen as she told them stories, not of her own achievement, but of the patience of stone and the generosity of fire. Years turned into decades. Ilara grew frail, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her spirit remained as solid as the core in her home. Thomas, now a gray-haired man himself, looked after her, ensuring her wood box was always full. The town of Hemlock's Ford was known throughout the region as the Warm Valley, a place that had learned to live with winter not as an enemy, but as a quiet guest. She died on a Tuesday in late autumn, sitting in her favorite chair with a book in her lap. She was 91 years old. A neighbor, finding her door unanswered, let himself in and found her there. The room was perfectly warm. The core, its surface smooth and unchanged after more than 50 years, was radiating its gentle, constant heat. She looked peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep. The entire valley turned out for her funeral. They did not bury her in the town cemetery. Instead, at Thomas's direction, they carried her up the small hill and laid her to rest beside Boro, overlooking the cabin that had changed everything. They didn't have a preacher deliver a long eulogy. Silas Blackwood's grandson, a boy who had only known a world of warm homes, spoke for everyone. He told the story of the white hurricane, of the cabin with no fireplace, of the woman who listened to a dead man's wisdom and trusted her own 2 hands. They erected a simple marker, not of polished marble, but of a single large piece of fieldstone, hauled from the same creek bed where she had found her first one. Thomas himself carved the inscription. It did not mention her name or the dates of her life. It said only, "She taught us how to wait for the warmth." Long after she was gone, the cabin remained. It became a sort of landmark, a monument. Hunters and travelers would sometimes take shelter within its walls, marveling at the massive stone structure that still, if someone were to light a fire within it, held the promise of an impossible heat. It stood as a testament not to a single act of defiance, but to a lifetime of quiet persistence. It was a story told in stone and clay, a story of how one person's patient labor, born of loss and necessity, could build a legacy that would warm a community for generations. The cabin, with its silent, waiting heart, outlasted them all, a permanent and profound answer to the skepticism of a world that had long since learned its lesson.